Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this episode, Hatty Nestor speaks to Guy McKinnon Little about her book Ethical Portraits and the uncertain place of portraiture within the often invisible cruelties of the criminal justice system.
Well, on that note, it might be good just to start off if you can maybe just introduce yourself and say a bit about, what it is you do and who you are and what this book is, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a writer and a journalist, and I write on class and culture and politics, criminal justice system, gender. And this book kind of came out of work I was doing around the Chelsea Manning case while she was in solitary confinement in 2016. And I got interested in a kind of wider question of how people are misrepresented and underrepresented by the criminal justice system and how that might be subverted in their favour or overwritten. So I kind of went about conducting interviews, and I spent a year in America researching. So this is kind of an archive of some work I was doing a bit further in the past. But it's really nice. It's published now, given COVID put everything on hold for everyone. So.
Yeah. But it's interesting though also because there has been this sort of, it's an interesting time for the book to come out, I think, because there has obviously been this sort of surge of interest in anti-carceral politics and abolition and all those sorts of things, largely driven by BLM and things like that, although probably not entirely. But aspects of sort of portraiture or visuality in general are sort of quite absent in the discussions that have kind of begun to take place around that. You know what I mean? Like in terms of like how you picture the criminal justice system, it's very much through those things like court sketches and mugshots and so on. But it's kind of like a sort of incidental aesthetic, like artifact, like the sort of thing you'd use to like, it's like a prop piece for your crime drama or something rather than something that's talked about as a kind of central component or, quite something that's quite important to the overall workings of that process. And I think I found the book quite interesting for that reason, because I read it and sort of thought like, oh, I haven't really thought about this at all, but it's also ubiquitous and obvious in this quite strange way. So I guess I wondered what sort of led you to kind of start thinking about, the politics of carceral justice in general. And then from there, how the idea of kind of portraiture emerged more specifically and how that specific idea sort of slots into that broader process. I mean, I suppose you teased at this in your intro, but I think it'd be good to expand.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had my own kind of personal family relationships, being interested in the prison system. But more broadly, it seemed like there wasn't much writing or research on drawn and painted portraits. There's kind of a big history of writing on mugshots and how they, on the one hand, act as a form of documentation, but also kind of stripped, obviously, inmates of their agency. But there's also this sort of strange in-between where, as you say, court sketches or forensic images, the Chelsea Manning portrait, there's a kind of power structure at work in the act of portraying as well on behalf of the system or person who is doing the portraying and the subject, which is obviously a very fraught idea of, who gets to own and represent who, and recognition and accountability. And obviously that's very, problematic for lots of ways. And I think what I wanted to do in the book was not necessarily make an argument for why something is or isn't unethical or ethical. It's more kind of unraveling ethics that might exist in a kind of institution or system of carcerality that chooses to not represent people. So what are the instances in the Chelsea Manning case where someone would need to be represented, for instance, in relation to their gender? There's a whole gendered argument that happens with this as well. And it was very fraught in relation to Chelsea Manning because obviously she's someone that is very famous and you would expect to be very overly represented in the media, and she is now. But at the time of writing this, the only kind of images that existed were her as Bradley in her military photograph, and then this photograph she'd leaked to someone within the army of her wearing a wig. So I think, there was a very stark question there of why is this person who has given, has kind of got the public platform to be represented, to be given that accountability, so underrepresented, and what are the kind of really difficult circumstances under which her support network had to create that portrait, and then what is lost and found during that depiction for the illustrator. So I think it's like kind of just repositioning the question of not necessarily representation as always being something that is positive, obviously, but also something that can create a wider problem than what it's trying to subvert, if that makes sense. I think that's true of the courtroom sketches. Like, just because you're represented doesn't mean that is necessarily, a positive thing for people that are bound up in this system. It actually can further misrepresent people.
Because I think it is very fraught, and there's obviously a risk of fetishizing representation as a kind of good in its own right. So, I mean, how would you qualify that distinction though between kind of representation as just something that sort of, is driven by this sort of like Sontag critique of the desire to kind of like make present this person as a worthwhile candidate for empathy, versus kind of the sort of depictions which can kind of have more sort of political traction in terms of how they grant agency and kind of subvert the system that they're responding to, and somehow kind of are operationalized in a way that doesn't just sort of generate like affect and melodrama, but little in the way of actual sort of political action.
The question of empathy is really interesting because obviously there's a whole voyeurism that happens with true crime and the lives of people we may not be able to empathise with because it's not our lived existence. I mean, that's like a huge thing that's come up with the whole like Black Lives Matter movement, and also George Floyd specifically. I think there's a lot of conversations around that. But in relation to the book, I think thinking about empathy as something that you do actually have a choice to extend, and that process isn't necessarily the best means to think about these modes of representation. And particularly with, fetishizing people, that's kind of where that contradiction can happen, I think, of whose place is it to extend themselves. But yeah, the courtroom sketch is really interesting to me because the woman I interviewed, Priscilla Coleman, who's like drawn loads of famous people like Charles Manson and Rolf Harris and Amy Winehouse, she really reveled in this kind of proximity to these people, but denied kind of any artistic agency in the way in which she chose to depict them explicitly. But yet the kind of subtleties of her comments about it unraveled that, she'd kind of make judgments that if the judge had a big chin, well, I wouldn't depict that because why would they want that to be depicted? So I think it was that kind of subtle interviewing that I did that hopefully unpicked actually the act of portraying, as I said, is bound up in also questions of empathy, voyeurism, and maybe in some of the later chapters, what the idea of like ascetic resistance might be, and if that's something we should be like, I don't know, trying to get under and support, or if it's actually something that needs to be like prodded further. I hope that, I think that answers that.
No, for sure. And then how did that sort of figure into the process of putting the book together? Because you sort of write about this a bit, where those the kind of the perils of voyeurism, or not to accuse you of voyeurism in any way, but like the risks of representation are very much sort of implicit in like journalism as a practice in general. And I sort of wondered how you encountered and navigated those things where, as you're saying, you're trying to like pay attention to these things and conduct interviews in a particular way, which does sort of reveal the subtleties at work. But I imagine there's also a huge amount of kind of self-doubt and discomfort, or at least when I'm trying to do these things, that permeates that process. And I'm curious about the ways that you sort of did or didn't encounter that.
It's really multifaceted, I think, like that question of if it's your place to be doing something and if not. And then, often with any kind of situation like the criminal justice system, you automatically in activist circles anyway hear people saying, oh, but, how do you have a relationship to that? Have you ever been in a prison? Do you have family in prison? There's always that question of like who gets to kind of take that space up, which is a whole other thing I find like quite difficult. But in terms of the interviews, I mean, I was really interested. I think a lot of that derived from, on the one hand, an interest in Janet Malcolm's work and the idea of like, you can't actually always defend journalism and it does do things wrong, and that's okay. You know, I think tried really honest in the book about like not trying to get things perfect, because the things that I'm looking at are kind of intrinsically very problematic. So the ways in which I go about trying to portray them might be too, and that's fine potentially, like not kind of shying away from trying to have this astute political and ethical like reflection around things is like something I found really difficult. But in terms of like oral history making as a political act, I think it is really important, and you know, how you kind of give space to certain people's voices. And obviously the best way to do that really is through interviews, if you think about interviewing as a way of archiving. So I think I just tried to think about my position as a way to try and tease out things I wanted to expose, as opposed to giving a prompt and letting there be a lot of space. So I think there was quite a big element of control on my part, which in hindsight I've thought about a lot in terms of having an agenda, and if that's the right agenda. And the people I interviewed picked up on that a bit, and I quite liked to show that. I think when you're dealing with other people and other voices in a text, which is obviously a really interesting collaborative way to work, right? In a way, I think it would be more potentially problematic to just sit in my room and like go on JSTOR and read some like text about representations in prisons and then write this kind of really convoluted text. Like, it's good to, you know, to have other people's voices in it, but, you know, the interviewer, much like the artist that depicts someone, does also play a role in that kind of creation of a portrait of someone. And so I tried to like think about that as well. How is the book also a form of portrait making in the face of talking about portraits? So not to get meta, but but
it's definitely there, and it sort of feeds back into what you're saying. It made me think of what you're saying earlier about the sort of politics of empathy and that kind of thing, where there's, you know, the way that's often realized is through political gestures, which are exactly like, as you're saying, kind of designed to be sort of risk-free, where it's like, you know, posting a black square, or like, you know, joining there's nothing wrong with reading groups, but like joining a reading group where it's like this kind of siloed activity where there isn't a risk of misunderstanding or misapprehension or kind of confusion, or you know, your own kind of agenda is sort of smoothed over. And I think that feeds back into what you're saying about empathy, because it's almost a sense, and this comes through in a lot of the examples you give in the book of artists who are working with us within this sphere, who are very aware of the ambiguity of the images they're producing, where I think the politics of empathy at their worst are often contaminated by this sort of fantasy of perfect understanding and, you know, kind of total communication. Whereas I think what you're doing in the book, and I think what you're sort of calling for more broadly, maybe in an implicit way, is a sort of a form of recognition or a form of solidarity, which recognizes that, you know, that the huge amount of friction that's necessary for that to sort of emerge in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. And the like Captured project for me was kind of the height of finding something problematic, of people kind of feeling like they're these social justice warriors and they can, like, you know, give a form of agency to prisoners through portrait making. I mean, just briefly, I mean, that project, these two guys like asked people in prison to like draw people that had been in their place. So, you know, like CEOs of Walmart or Coca-Cola or whatever, that had done kind of a big, longer list of crimes than the prisoner drawing them. But yet the prisoner is still re-representing that person that's re-represented through drawing them. So on the one hand, they wanted to kind of give agency, to kind of give a broader recognition to white-collar crimes and who kind of gets away in the eyes of justice. And as we know, that's like deeply fraught in the US, which is where the book is about more than the UK. But I always found it quite problematic the way they felt that they kind of were adding something to people's lives through actually asking them a very specific task to draw basically white men in these kind of traditional portraits that you'd see in, I don't know, House of Parliament or wherever, the White House in the US. But I don't think that actually creates their agenda. I felt that was really uncomfortable and kind of a vanity project on their part, maybe. I don't know. I just found it, difficult. So, yeah, it's kind of, as you say, navigating all of that. You know, it's not a book which is kind of a manifesto for why we should be representing people better or in a different way. It's more kind of looking at this arena. It felt like a bit like a circus and trying to understand which different people are doing what, like who are the jugglers and whatever. You know, it's like they're all doing something that's kind of fringy in a way or like problematic. But if there's enough self-reflection on that, I think comes through quite subtly in their answers. But not all of them are that cynical. So
yeah, for sure. It's important to have a healthy mixture of cynicism and generosity, I guess, is what we all aspire to.
And satire too. Like, I think satire is something I thought a lot in the book. Yeah.
How so?
Yeah. Well, that project seemed very satirical to me, and I think I'm quite a satirist at heart, and not very serious in my real life. So it's like also this kind of voice that you like put together in a book where you seem very like serious and principled, and you're trying to do this thing to reveal this recognition and representation. Actually, I don't really think that way in my life very much. So where does satire play for me? And was that in the way I interviewed people? I think so. But I mean, the Captured project felt incredibly satirical to me. It's this kind of like social uncovering of these like white men doing these awful things. It's like, well, we've known for like 25 years. That's not this kind of like underground, like, I don't know, cutting edge activist point that you're making. Like, we all know, like, obviously. So I didn't really feel like it was very radical, not to kind of overuse that word. It just felt like really satirical and kind of a way of giving representation and recognition to those two people through the act of a kind of portrait making that didn't seem very ethical to me, if ethics comes into it. So
and then I think the other thing that you talk about, which it might be good to sort of pivot to, is the way various forms of forensic portraiture in particular have figured into how we kind of construct and perceive criminality, and how that then feeds into, or is kind of being seeded into, various frameworks of surveillance and facial recognition and so on and so forth. Because I think that history is quite interesting, and I also sort of I found it interesting to read through, because there's, on the one hand, this impulse which might feed into some of the projects you discuss in the book, where it's about sort of revealing what's going on inside the prison. And then I think what that history reveals is also how what's going on inside the prison is also doesn't begin and end within that structure, and kind of does have this broader social reach in terms of its consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also tried to say that the criminal justice system isn't just like, you know, once you're in prison, there's this like suspended temporality that happens like from the moment you're like summoned to trial, the trial, you know, all of it, the way in which you're then surveyed and held within a kind of structure of constraint, even if that psychic constraint does exist. And I think that is kind of very central to the issues of like forensic portraiture as well, in terms of on the one hand, trying to frame people, which is very common in the US. You know, how do you kind of gather information about someone's physicality, which obviously has huge racial implications and does, in order to frame them and kind of make them a suspect, even if there isn't a lot of evidence that they've done a crime. So I think it's actually a tool of arrest for a lot of people, forensics. But the history of it's really interesting, and I think I came across it, looking at this kind of reconstruction of a witch who had died like 300 years ago in Scotland, and the kind of process of how one comes to not only like understanding someone's gender in the history, but also then what do you draw on to create that, right? Because that kind of goes all the way through the question of forensics now as well. and the kind of projects and ideas I came across in that kind of lineage of physicality and framing, like there was a really problematic, which I think could, quite astutely be called problematic prison program in the 50s in the States, where this guy like invited people to have their like noses reduced and parts of their face through facelifts because your physicality would actually like change your likeliness to re-offend. And people loved it, like loads of people were up for it. He wrote a book on it called Prison Doctor. It was like this huge thing. But obviously, if you think about how that process might take place with forensics, it's really scary. And, obviously we all know that we're surveyed and, our data is collected on a mass scale. But I don't think people think about it very much in terms of portrait making or face making or how, if you were missing, how would the government create a kind of portrait of you in your wake in a way? Like, how do we find people when their physical self is absent, right? And that's what a lot of forensic artists do for the police. They'll make a model of someone from descriptions from family or maybe a photograph, but as like that woman Kelly Lawson says, like she'll just feel that they had blue eyes and had blue eyes. So that kind of objectivity is kind of, readily overturned in their descriptions of their job. And that's kind of where the artistic agency comes in, I think. And that's why it's like, can get very spirally, because then you wonder, well, what is a realistic depiction? And that kind of goes back to the inherent question of the book, that portraying is never that kind of objective documentation of someone. A lot of people would argue helps with photography. And then Heather Dewey-Hagberg obviously did some really interesting like forensic portraits of Chelsea Manning that were gender neutral as a kind of like middle finger to that process that's used by law enforcement. And it was really interesting to talk to her, the idea of collecting DNA of someone in a prison through their hair and from a piece of hair that's like sent in the post. It's a very like intricate, strange process of like, how does a part of yourself be removed from the prison if you can't kind of physically leave? Well, in a way you are. And there's like, I don't know, something quite interesting there in terms of our physical self. But then Heather Dewey-Hagberg, made these like 3D models of gender neutral faces from someone that identifies as a woman. And it's, it's interesting, right? Because so many of forensic portraits are just male and female used by law enforcement. So there's a whole like gendered question that comes up a bit as well. It's really complicated, the forensic stuff, because there's so many different tools used, scientific methods, kind of histories drawn upon that are very like colonial and racist, ideas about what an ideal physicality is, what a criminal looks like, who should be framed, who shouldn't. So there's lots of elements to it, and a lot of it I couldn't get my head around, so I don't know how to use a lot of that like technology. But the kind of more subjective questions of selfhood, I think, really like spoke to me with that.
But I think that question of selfhood is sort of, I guess, perhaps maybe the sort of central question that guides the book and maybe holds together the different sort of examples you pull from, because as you're just saying now, there is this history of how the certain technologies and tools and various, systems and ideas have been deployed to kind of create this politics of recognition where, you can sort of recognize who is someone you're supposed to care for and who is someone whose life you think of as disposable based purely kind of on this visual field. And I think that's what's quite interesting about the book, is that you make the case, I think, that some form of representation is necessary, or is useful, at least potentially. And it's because of its power to kind of shift the boundaries of that community of kind of lives we consider worthwhile, and people were able to kind of extend compassion to, and like solidarity and so on and so forth. And you talk a bit about that in relation to sort of grievability, as well as sort of discussed by Judith Butler. And I thought it might be quite interesting to sort of dive into that a bit. It's something that's maybe kind of implicit in the book, but maybe, I don't want to say underexplored, but sort of like just out of view or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like Judith Butler's work really informed the book, like giving an account of oneself, the kind of arguments she brings up in Frames of War and grievability, and how do we grieve a life if we don't even have like an idea of that life at all? Well, one of the ways in which that might happen is through representation, right? And yeah, where does mourning take place? Can mourning take place, or does it just turn into a kind of melancholia where we can't actually like relate to an object or a subject? It's just kind of left in this in-between limbo where a real mourning doesn't happen. And I think, obviously everyone loves to drop Judith Butler into these arguments, but I do think there is something very inherent and useful about the idea of grievability that relates to this project, because for her it's so rooted in her earlier work on giving an account of oneself and senses of the subject, and the idea that subjecthood is also founded on the ways in which we're accounted for by the state and the government and society, not just on a kind of interpersonal singular level. And I think there's something like, really like hopeful there in the way that like, we are intersubjective people. The world is, we need one another to like come into being and like have purpose and meaning and all that kind of stuff. But I think her work does really speak to some of the conversations going on in relation to indefinite detention, prisons, migrant crisis, particularly transgender inmates in prison, and the hierarchy which happens within prison as well of grievability and recognition. So obviously being trans and of colour in prison is going to be much more difficult for a lot of people than if you're, a tough, very macho white male. So I think she touches on all of that. But I think, and it also goes on to like what Nancy Fraser talks about a lot as well, that to be recognised is to be given worth, and therefore you can be grieved and mourned, is a really powerful argument for many situations in which life is deemed ungrievable and disposable, which obviously the prison industrial complex does. I mean, it's an abattoir. It literally consumes people and spits them out. I mean, it's like the scale of it in the US and slowly here, like the new book I'm working on about the kind of slow privatization of prisons since the 90s in the UK really reflects that model in the US. And I think there's something dangerous that happens between the UK and the US where people think, oh, that's the situation going on over here, but we're still in this kind of like old Labour government where they're like, oh, of course everything will be state owned. Well, no, that's also going to happen with prisons, and is. And there's huge prisons being built up near Liverpool at the moment in Yorkshire that kind of really reflect that supermax prison that Bill Clinton brought in the 90s. So yeah, there's a lot there. But in terms of Judith Butler, she was really helpful for my work and the kind of more philosophical questions of worth, grieving, mourning, melancholia, the idea of melancholia as opposed to mourning, and how that relates to images of oneself too, right? I mean, people have their Facebook profile in their wills now. I mean, there's lots of kind of frames in which that could come up for us too if we're not in prison. It's like a really intricate, complex debate actually. And I think although people disregard her quite a lot now, there is something central there that I think has a kind of timelessness to it.
Yeah, it's kind of annoyingly good how, well, not like annoying, like how many occasions there are to sort of like, it's got to be like the most epigraphed epigraph like ever.
Yeah.
But for good reason. The other thing I was curious to sort of ask about is there has obviously been this like sort of mass shift in terms of discussions of prisons and everything, like the whole kind of cluster of politics that surrounds that over the past few years. And I was sort of thinking about the way that like a large part of what seems to have enabled that to happen now is in part a sort of shift in visual culture where, it's possible to kind of have these images or videos that provide a kind of access point for collective action, or kind of, there's a group which can converge around these like very horrific scenes of police violence that are able to be documented and distributed in a way that perhaps wasn't always possible. And I don't want to presume a link there, but I also do think there's perhaps something interesting going on. I mean, I guess reading the book, I kept thinking about the way that visuality kind of underpins this whole thing in a way that's quite often disregarded. And I wondered if you thought about the sort of the role of images and identification and portraits and visuals and like visuality in general as a sort of catalyst for shifts in how, public awareness around the really horrific practices of mass incarceration and carceral justice in general and policing and all these things has kind of shifted quite rapidly in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think like going on from that question of grievability, obviously, for so many people, Black men and women in the States, their kind of recognition and accountability only happens in the instance of their death, right? So we get kind of like trapped in this perpetual loop where on the one hand, yes, these images should be circulated and the horror of them kind of, arouses this reaction in people to want something else. But then does that person only become known and grieved through the video of their death, right? And the images of their death. So thinking about representation as something that can, on the one hand, be a catalyst, but also can be very horrifying. That has happened in other situations too, like the Iraq War, all the images there that were circulated. And I don't know, I mean, I think I didn't get into that too much because that felt like a whole other book and I didn't want to kind of just dip my toe. But I think there is something really important to be argued about. Do we only feel a call for change or a different kind of representation in the face of one that's almost so horrifying and so disturbing that you wished it hadn't happened, but it was that very like juncture of encountering it that you become aware of how horrible it is. And I think, like Eric Garner is a prison activist in California who writes about that a lot, like how do we get caught in these loops of visibility and what do they serve in the face of murder? And that's, on the one hand, a really difficult subject, but also quite clear to me. I think it is to a lot of people clear why that should be thought about further. But in terms of a mode of representation that overcomes that, I don't really know what that would be. But I think it goes back to that question of just to be represented doesn't necessarily mean that gives kind of, I don't know, kind of kindness to your life or, an empathetic understanding of what you might have wanted. And that is so fundamental to mourning, right? And that doesn't also mean when someone's dead. It also can be people that are kind of sentenced to a death by indefinite detention or solitary confinement. It's not just death in the kind of like linearity that we're told to think about it as, in kind of Western society, but also like modes of structure of what gives your like life worth. Yeah, and I want to think about that more and write about that more, hopefully. But it's, I've spoken to quite a lot of people about that and there's quite mixed reactions, which I'm quite surprised of, because to me it's like the horror of the loop of that is what has been the catalyst.
Yeah, I guess that you could see it in one way as like sort of there's a response to that horror, which isn't just a sort of straightforward one-to-one response. It's a response which is sort of compelled by not just the horrific image, but the kind of the conditions under which it's produced, where you don't have the life, you don't have the thing, you just have the horrific image. And in your kind of what compels you is as much the absence of that as but that's maybe a bit generous. I don't know.
No, you're basically saying what I've like ranted about much more clearly in 2 sentences. So I really appreciate it.
I don't think there's much more that I wanted to ask about, but it's been really, really lovely to chat. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot more to say, I think, on it, but
but that's kind of necessary.
Thank you, though. I really appreciated it. So
cool.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.